By the light of a tallow candle at one end of a rough table, a man was reading something written in a book. It was an old account book, greatly worn, and the writing was not apparently very legible because the man sometimes held the page close to the flame of the candle to get a stronger light upon it. The shadow of the book would throw half the room into obscurity, darkening a number of faces and figures. For besides the reader, 8 other men were present. 7 of them sat against the rough log walls, silent and motionless, and the room being small, not very far from the table. By extending an arm, any one of them could have touched the 8th man, who lay on the table, face upward, partly covered by a sheet, his arms at his sides, dead. The man with the book was not reading aloud, and no one spoke. All seemed to be waiting for something. The dead man alone was without expectation. From the blank darkness outside came in through the aperture that served for a window all the ever unfamiliar noises of night in the wilderness, the long, nameless note of a distant coyote, the stilly pulsing thrill of insects in trees, the strange cries of night birds, so different from those of the birds of day. But nothing of this was noted in that company. Its members were not overmuch addicted to idle interest in matters of no practical importance. That was obvious in every line of their rugged faces, obvious even in the dim light of the single candle. They were evidently men of the vicinity, farmers and woodmen. The person reading the book was a trifle different. One would have said of him that he was of the world, worldly, albeit there was in his attire that which attested a certain fellowship with the organisms of his environment. And his coat would hardly have passed muster in San Francisco. His footgear was not of urban origin, and the hat that lay by him on the floor, he was the only one uncovered, was such that if one had considered it as an article of mere personal adornment, he would have missed its meaning. In countenance, the man was rather prepossessing, with just a hint of sternness, although that he may have assumed or cultivated as appropriate to one in authority, because he was a coroner. Now it is by virtue of his office that he had possession of the book that he was then reading. It had been found among the dead man's effects in his cabin, where the inquest was now taking place. When the coroner had finished reading, he put the book into his breast pocket, and at that same moment the door was pushed open and a young man entered. Now he clearly was not of mountain birth and breeding. He was clad as those who dwell in cities. His clothing was dusty, however, as from travel, because he'd been riding hard to attend the inquest. The coroner nodded. No one else greeted him. "We have waited for you," said the coroner. "We must get through this business tonight." The young man smiled. "I'm sorry to have kept you," he said. "I went away not to evade your summons, but to post to my newspaper an account of what I suppose I'm called back to relate." The coroner smiled. "The account that you posted to your newspaper," he said, "differs probably from that which you will give here under oath." "That," replied the other, rather hotly, "is as you choose. I used manifold paper, and I have a copy of what I sent. It was not written as news, for it is incredible, but as fiction. It may go as a part of my testimony under oath." "But you said that it was incredible." "That is nothing to you, sir, if I also swear that it is true." The coroner was silent for some moments, and then he spoke. "We will resume the inquest." The witness was sworn. "What is your name?" the coroner asked. "William Harker. Age, 27. You knew the deceased, Hugh Morgan?" "Yes." "You were with him when he died?" "Near him." "How did that happen? Your presence, I mean." "I was visiting him to shoot and fish. A part of my purpose, however, was to study him and his odd, solitary way of life. He seemed a good model for a character in fiction. I sometimes write stories. I sometimes read them. Thank you. Stories in general, I mean, not yours. Some of the jurors laughed. Relate the circumstances of the man's death, said the coroner. You may use any notes or memoranda that you please. The witness understood. Pulling a manuscript from his breast pocket, he held it near the candle and, turning the leaves until he found the passage that he wanted, he began to read. The sun had hardly risen when we left the house. We were looking for quail, each with a shotgun, but we had only one dog. Morgan said that our best ground was beyond a certain ridge that he pointed out, and so we crossed it by a trail through the chaparral. On the other side was comparatively level ground, thickly covered with wild oats. As we emerged from the chaparral, Morgan was a few yards ahead of me, and suddenly we heard at a little distance to our right and partly in front a noise as of some animal thrashing about in the bushes, which we could see were violently agitated. Oh, we've started a deer, I said. Wish we'd bought a rifle. Morgan, who'd stopped and was intently watching the agitated chaparral, said nothing, but he had cocked both barrels of his gun and was holding us in readiness. I thought him a trifle excited, which surprised me because he had a reputation for exceptional coolness, even in moments of sudden and imminent peril. Oh, come on, I said. You're not going to fill up a deer with quail shot, are you? Still, he didn't reply. But catching a sight of his face as he turned it slightly towards me, I was struck by its pallor. And then I understood that we had serious business on hand. My first conjecture was that we had jumped a grizzly, so I advanced to Morgan's side, cocking my gun as I moved. The bushes were quieter now, and the sounds had ceased, but Morgan was as attentive to the place as before. What is it? I said. What the devil is it? That damned thing, he replied, without turning his head. His voice was husky and unnatural, and he trembled visibly. I was about to speak further when I observed the wild oats near the place of the disturbance moving in a most inexplicable way. I can hardly describe it. It seemed as if stirred by a streak of wind, which not only bent it, but pressed it down, crushed it, so that it did not rise, and this movement was slowly prolonging itself directly towards us. Now, nothing that I'd ever seen before had affected me so strangely as this, and yet I'm unable to recall any sense of fear. I remember, and I tell this here because I recollected it then, that once, in looking carelessly out of an open window, I momentarily mistook a small tree close at hand for a group of larger trees at a little distance away. It looked the same size as the others, but being more distinctly and sharply defined in mass and detail, it seemed out of harmony with them. I mean, it was a mere falsification of the law of aerial perspective, but it startled, it almost terrified me. You see, we rely upon the orderly operation of familial natural laws, that any seeming suspension of them is noted as a menace to our safety, a warning of calamity. And so now the apparently causeless movement of the herbage and the slow, undeviating approach of the line of disturbance were distinctly disquieting. My companion appeared positively frightened, and I could hardly credit my senses when I saw him suddenly throw his gun to his shoulder and fire both barrels at the agitated grass. Before the smoke of the discharge had cleared away, I heard a loud, savage cry. It was a scream like that of a wild animal, and flinging his gun upon the ground, Morgan sprang away and ran from the spot. At the same instant, I was thrown violently to the ground by the impact of something unseen in the smoke, some soft, heavy substance. It seemed thrown against me with great force. Before I could get upon my feet and recover my gun, which seemed to have been struck from my hands, I heard Morgan crying out in agony, and mingling with his cries were such savage sounds as one only hears from fighting dogs. Terrified, I struggled to my feet and looked in the direction of Morgan's retreat. And may heaven spare me from another sight like that. At a distance of less than 30 yards was my friend, down upon one knee, his head thrown back at a frightful angle, his long hair in disorder, and his whole body in violent movement from side to side, backward and forward. His right arm was lifted and seemed to lack the hand, at least I could see no hand, and the other arm was invisible. And at times, as my memory now reports this extraordinary scene, I could discern but a part of his body. It was as if he had been partly blotted out. I can offer no other expression than that. And then a shifting of his position would bring it all into view again. Now, all this must have occurred within a few seconds, and yet in that time, Morgan assumed all the postures of a determined wrestler vanquished by superior weight and strength. I saw nothing but him, and him not distinctly, and during the entire incident, his shouts and curses were heard, as if through an enveloping uproar of such sounds of rage and fury as I had never heard from the throat of man or brute. For a moment I stood irresolute, and then throwing down my gun, I ran forward to my friend's assistance. I had a vague belief that he was suffering from a fit or a convulsion. But before I could reach his side, he was down and quiet. All sounds had ceased, and I now saw the same mysterious movement of the wild oats prolonging itself from the trampled area about the prostrate man towards the edge of a wood. It was only when I'd reached the wood that I was able to withdraw my eyes and look at my companion, and he was dead. The coroner now rose from his seat and stood beside the dead man. Lifting an edge of the sheet, he pulled it away, exposing the naked body. It showed a clay-like yellow in the candlelight, but it had all over it broad maculations of bluish black. The chest and sides looked as if they'd been beaten with a bludgeon, and there were dreadful lacerations. In places, the skin was torn in strips and shreds. The coroner moved round to the end of the table and undid a silk handkerchief which had been passed under the chin and knotted on the top of the head. And when the handkerchief was drawn away, it exposed what had been the throat. Some of the jurors who'd risen to get a better view repented their curiosity and turned away their faces. And witness Harker went to the open window, leaned out across the sill, faint and sick. Dropping the handkerchief upon the dead man's neck, the coroner stepped to an angle of the room and from a pile of clothing produced one garment after another, each of which he held up for a moment of inspection. All were torn and stiff with blood. The jurors did not make a closer inspection. They seemed, in fact, rather uninterested. They had, in truth, seen all this before. The only thing that was new to them was Harker's testimony. "Gentlemen," the coroner said, "we have no more evidence, I think. Your duty has already been explained to you. If there is nothing you wish to ask, You may go outside and consider your verdict." The foreman rose, a tall, bearded man of 60, coarsely clad. "I should like to ask one question, Mr. Coroner," he said. "What asylum did your last witness escape from?" "Mr. Harker," said the coroner, "from what asylum did you escape?" Harker flushed crimson but said nothing, and the 7 jurors rose and solemnly filed out of the cabin. "If you have done insulting me, sir," said Harker, when he and the officer were alone with the dead man, "I suppose I'm at liberty to go." The coroner nodded. Harker started to leave, but paused with his hand on the door latch. The habit of his profession was stronger in him than his sense of personal dignity. "The book that you have there," he said. I recognize it. It's Morgan's diary. You seem greatly interested in it. You read from it as I was testifying. Might I see it? I do think the public would like. The book will cut no figure in this matter," replied the coroner. "All the entries in it were made before the writer's death." Well, Harker passed out of the house just as the jury re-entered and stood about the table on which the now covered corpse showed under the sheet with sharp definition. The foreman seated himself near the candle, produced from his breast pocket a pencil and scrap of paper, and laboriously wrote out the following verdict, which, with varying degrees of effort, all signed. "We, the jury, do find that the remains come to their death at the hands of a mountain lion, but some of us think all the same they had fits." Now, in the diary of the late Hugh Morgan are certain interesting entries having possibly some scientific value as suggestions. Now, as you've heard, at the inquest, this book was not put in evidence. Possibly the coroner did not wish to confuse the jury. Now, the date of the first entry that's worth quoting cannot be ascertained because the upper part of the leaf is torn away. But that part which remains runs as follows. "He would run in a half circle, keeping his head turned always toward the center, and again he would stand still, barking furiously. At last he ran away into the brush as fast as he could go. I thought at first that he'd gone mad, but on returning to the house, I found no other alteration in his manner. Can a dog see with his nose? I mean, do odors impress some olfactory center with images of the thing emitting them?" September the 2nd. Looking at the stars last night as they rose above the crest of the eastern ridge, I observed them successively disappear from left to right. Each was eclipsed but for an instant, and only a few at any one time. But along the entire length of the ridge, all that were within a degree or two of the crest were blotted out. It was as if something had passed along between me and them, but I could not see anything, and the stars were not thick enough to define its outline. I don't like this. Several weeks' entries are missing, 3 leaves being torn from the book. And then, September the 27th, it has been about here again. I find evidences of its presence every day. I watched again all of last night in the same cover, gun in hand, double charged with buckshot. In the morning, there were fresh footprints as before, and yet I could have sworn that I did not sleep. Indeed, I hardly sleep at all these days. It's terrible, insupportable. I mean, if these experiences are real, then I shall go mad. If they're fanciful, then I'm mad already. October the 3rd. I shall not leave. It shall not Drive me away. This is my house. This is my land. God hates a coward. October the 5th. I can stand it no longer. I've invited Harker to pass a few weeks with me. He has a level head. I can judge from his manner if he thinks me mad. October the 7th. I have the solution to the problem. It came to me last night. Suddenly. Oh, how simple. How horribly simple. There are sounds that we cannot hear. At either end of the scale are notes that stir no chord of that imperfect instrument, the human ear. They're too high or too grave. I have observed a flock of blackbirds occupying an entire treetop, several treetops, and all in full song. And suddenly, in a moment, at absolutely the same instant, all spring into the air and fly away. Now, how? And they couldn't see one another. Whole treetops intervened. At no point could a leader have been visible to every one of them. There must have therefore been a signal of warning or a command, high and shrill above the din, but unheard by me. I've observed too the same simultaneous flight when all was silent, not only among blackbirds, but other birds, quail, for example, widely separated by bushes, even on the opposite sides of a hill. It's known to sailors as well, isn't it, that a school of whales basking or sporting on the surface of the ocean, miles apart perhaps, with the convexity of the earth between them, will sometimes dive down at the same instant. All gone out of sight in that moment. Signal has been sounded, too grave for the ear of man, who nevertheless feels its vibrations in the ship as the stones of a cathedral are stirred by the bass of the organ. Well, as with sounds, so with colours. At each end of the solar spectrum, the chemist can detect the presence of what are known as actinic rays. They represent colours, integral colours in the composition of light, which we are unable to discern. The human eye is as imperfect an instrument as the ear. It ranges but a few octaves of the real chromatic scale. I'm not mad. There are colours that we cannot see. And God help me. The damned thing is of such a colour.